cross. It was meant to horrify the world. It was meant for humiliation. It was meant to last for days. It was meant for slow asphyxiation. It was meant to prolong torture. It was the Roman soldier's job. It was meant to be used by Caesar, but instead, it was used by God. It was meant to stop a movement, but instead, it became the way. It was meant to act on fear, but instead, it awakened faith. It was meant to be vicious and violent, but instead, it became our peace. It was meant to uproot hope, but instead, it became the seed. It was meant to punish captives, but instead, it unleashed freedom. It was meant to build up Rome, but instead, it built God's kingdom. It was meant to discourage rebels. It was meant to stop insurrection. It was meant to put down Jesus, but instead it set up his resurrection. It was meant to jeer and mock him, but instead it was his glory. It was meant to erase a chapter, but instead it became the story. It was meant to hold up convicts, but instead it raised up a king. It was meant to shut our mouth, but instead it's why we sing. It was meant to be a judgment, but instead it became our mercy. It's why the song of heaven is the Lamb is worthy. It was meant to kill an enemy, crush dissenters and diversion, but instead it became the banner of God's love for every person. It was meant to be appalling, nailing hands and feet to wood. It was meant to be used for evil, but instead it was used for good.
If we were able to go back in time and on that Friday night, if we were able to go back and have a conversation with Jesus' mother Mary at the end of that horrific day, and if we were able to do that and in that moment we were able to explain to her what was going to happen over the next several hundred years, that here we would sit in 2021 honoring, commemorating, memorializing, and celebrating this day, and then if we were able to explain to her that we had actually titled this day Good Friday, I would imagine for her in that moment, it would make zero sense. In fact, to any one of Jesus' closest followers, Peter, James, John, Mary Magdalene, and any of the other ones that were close to him and were there in those last hours, I would imagine to try to explain to them why we would call this day Good Friday, they would say that just can't be. See, Good Friday is, in a way, it's like an oxymoron. You know what an oxymoron is? It's like jumbo shrimp. Where you put two words right next to each other that in and of themselves, the one makes sense, but when you slam it next to the other one, it just doesn't. And that really is what today is all about. That today is all about sorrow. But as we just heard so eloquently, what was meant for sorrow gives us reason to sing. That in what was meant to bring sorrow, we discover what joy really means. That in order for us to understand joy the way we were meant to understand it, we have to understand the full weight of sorrow. That in order for us to understand what forgiveness means, on Sunday we're going to celebrate the beauty of life, and yet, in order for us to understand forgiveness, we first have to understand guilt. In order for us to understand life, we have to understand the significance and the weight of death. And so, in a way, today is meant to be heavy. It's meant to feel sad, and it's going to, as it should, because we can't enter into joy until we understand and explain sorrow. We can't understand forgiveness until we deal with our guilt. We can't understand life until we deal with death. And so, we're just going to sit in our homes today and reflect, because that's the only way good can come out of what happened on that Friday. There were no songs sung that day. They couldn't find words, let alone songs to sing. The day didn't end with a promise. There was no hope on the horizon when the sun set on that Friday. Everything they believed, and the one that they believed in, was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Silence filled the air and sorrow filled their hearts. What do you do when hope dies? Have you ever had hope die? A dream die? People try to tell you all the cliches, and it's not that they aren't true, it's just that in that moment, you don't want to hear them. You don't want to hear good will come out of this, right? You don't want to hear someday you'll understand. You don't want to hear one day you'll look back and all of this will make sense. You don't want someone to point to the Bible and say, and we know that God works in all things for good for those who love the Lord. It's not that you don't believe that necessarily, but in that moment, you don't want to hear that because it feels like God isn't working. It feels like God's given up. It feels like God may not even be there. It feels like God may not even be real. And my guess is you felt that. And you know what? I felt that too. And so did those who walked with Jesus. So did Mary, Jesus' mother, who watched her son die in front of her. She had dreams, and she watched them all die in front of her. She had dreams of watching her son get married. She had dreams of playing with grandchildren. She had dreams of seeing her son do more good in the world than he had done up until that point, if that was even possible. But it was possible because Mary believed in her son. She believed he was not only her son, but that he was the Son of God. And the things that she had seen when he came into the world, she had held them in her heart from that night in the manger when he was born until Thursday night. But on Friday morning, it was all gone because he was gone. And her dreams died. Her hope died because her son died, and he died because of her. He died because of me. He died because of you. The reality of sin, and that it's sin that separates all of humanity from a holy God, and that sin required a sinless sacrifice. It was because of sin and because God so loved this world, because God so loved you and I, that he sent his one and only Son into this world, not to condemn it, but to be a sacrifice that would pay the penalty of that sin. My sin, your sin, the things you know about yourself that no one else knows, the things that you spend so much time, money, and energy hiding from other people, who you really are when no one is looking, the things that you're ashamed of, or the things that you'd be embarrassed for others to know, the things in you and about you that you wish you could change but you can't seem to. When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time, and he died for us sinners. Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. And since we've been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son while we were still his enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his Son. Those are powerful words that Paul wrote, words that have incredible implications for you and for me today. But my guess is, Mary didn't know that, nor did she want to hear that on that Friday. While her son was thinking of you and I, she was thinking of her baby. And his life flashed in her mind's eye as his eyes closed. And in that moment, Mary didn't know that her son's death would restore our relationship with our Heavenly Father, but it did, and so. I want the weight of what Mary felt that Friday to sit with you and I on this Friday. I want the weight of what Mary felt that Friday and why she needed to feel it to sit with you for just a few moments. And I want you to reflect in your heart and mind about why today matters so much for you. That Mary felt that she and her son had been abandoned by God on that Friday so that you and I could be adopted as sons and daughters of God on this Friday. So today, let us take a few moments and reflect on the good that came from all that happened on that Friday. That because of what happened, you and I, because of what happened on that Friday, we can have hope in the midst of all that is happening on this Friday. And it's all because of who he is and what he did because of and for you. and from me. If you have some emblems in your home, crackers and juice, bread or wine, whatever you have, I'd invite you to take them and hold those elements in your hand as we sit for just a moment and reflect. Jesus was sitting in a room with his closest friends, in a room like you're sitting in right now. And his friends were talking, they were laughing and carrying on. They were talking about things they had seen. And then in an instant, Jesus stood up and he began to talk about things they were about to see. They didn't understand what he was trying to say to them, and I'm sure he knew that, but he did his best to try to explain what was about to happen and why it was about to happen. He lifted up a piece of bread and he broke it in front of them, and he said that this bread represents my body, which will be broken for you. And he invited them to take and eat it, and as often as they would do so from there on out, he invited them to remember him. And so today, whoever you are, wherever you are, I invite you to take of the bread and eat it and remember him. Jesus was still standing trying to explain to his closest friends what was about to happen, and he lifted up a cup. He held it in front of them. He was speaking in ways they didn't understand, but he was speaking powerfully and beautifully, and he said that this cup represented the blood of a new covenant, a covenant that would be made between God and man, and that it would be made in his blood, and that his blood was about to be poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And he said to his friends and to you and I today, that as often as you take of this, do so in remembrance of him. And so I invite you today, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you've been to and through in your life, no matter who you are when no one is looking, know that God sees what no one else does. And while you are still a sinner, and while you were still a sinner, Christ willingly came and died for you. So take and drink and remember him.
It was meant to be a symbol of God's assassination, but instead, it became the symbol of Jesus' invitation. Come to the cross. Instead of sin and stain, you are meant to be made clean. Instead of being forgotten, you are meant to know you're seen. Instead of being ashamed, you can leave behind your guilt. Instead of feeling empty, you were meant to be fulfilled. Instead of being broken, you are meant to be made whole. Here, Calvary is calling. It beckons you. Behold, come to the cross. Instead of being an accident, you have a purpose and a plan. Instead of being abandoned, you were chosen by his hand. For all who've said I can't, God has said I can. No matter what you've done, the invitation stands. Come to the cross. Instead of being doubtful, you are meant to know your Father. You are meant to be his son, and you are meant to be his daughter. You were cherished from the start. You were always in the picture. Instead of being a victim, you were meant to be a victor. The result of Jesus' blood, salvation has arrived. Instead of being dead, you are meant to be alive. The cross. It was meant to signal death, but instead, it's a sign of living. It was meant to be the end, but instead, it's our beginning.